My son got married and didn't invite me, yet wanted to spend his honeymoon at my house. So I sent a letter that changed everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined that the most devastating news of my life would come through a Facebook notification while I was enjoying my morning coffee on the deck of my lake house. My name is Dorothy, and at 71, I thought I'd experienced every kind of teen heartbreak that life could offer. I was wrong. It was a beautiful Saturday morning in June, the kind of day that made me grateful for the peaceful retirement I'd built on the shores of Lake Windermere. The sun was dancing on the water, the birds were singing in the pine trees that surrounded my property, and I was settling in to read the newspaper when my phone buzzed with a social media alert. David Patterson tagged you in a photo. The notification. Read, and my heart immediately lifted. My son rarely posted on social media, so any mention was a treat for a mother who lived 3 hours away and cherished every digital connection to his life. But when I opened the photo, my coffee cup slipped from my hands and shattered on the deck's wooden planks. There was David, my only child, my precious boy who I'd raised alone after his father died when he was 12, standing at an altar in a tuxedo I'd never seen, kissing a woman in a wedding dress while a crowd of people I didn't recognize cheered. In the background, the caption read, "Just married. Mr. and Mrs. David Patterson. Thank you to everyone who made our special day perfect." I stared at the phone screen until my eyes burned, hoping I was somehow misunderstanding what I was seeing. But there was no mistaking it. My son had gotten married, and I hadn't been invited. I hadn't even known he was engaged. The woman in the wedding dress was Miranda Collins, his girlfriend of 2 years, who I'd met exactly 3 times, always briefly, always with some excuse about why they couldn't stay long or visit more often. She was beautiful in a sharp, calculating way, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of confidence that came from always getting what she wanted. I scrolled through the comments on the photo, my heart breaking more with each congratulatory message from friends and relatives I recognized. My sister Helen had written, "Beautiful ceremony. So happy for you both." My nephew Michael had posted, "Congratulations, cousin. What a perfect day." Even David's high school friends, people I'd known since they were teenagers, had commented with love and best wishes. Everyone had been there. Everyone except me. The photo album that Miranda had tagged me in told the complete story of a wedding that had been planned for months. Professional photographs showed the engagement party I'd never heard about, the bachelor and bachelorette parties I'd never been invited to, the rehearsal dinner where David's friends and coworkers had toasted the happy couple while his mother sat alone at her lake house, completely unaware that her son was getting married the next day. The evidence was overwhelming and humiliating. I had been deliberately excluded from every aspect of my son's wedding. I called David immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I'd called thousands of times over the past 34 years. When he answered, I could hear party music and laughter in the background. "Mom," he said, his voice slightly slurred with champagne and celebration. "Hey, what's up?" The casual tone was like a knife to my heart. He was speaking to me, like I was a casual acquaintance checking in, not his mother calling about his wedding day. "David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I just saw the photos on Facebook. You got married?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear him moving away from the party noise, probably stepping outside or into a quiet room. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming defensive and uncomfortable. "Yeah, Mom, we did. It was a small ceremony, very intimate. Miranda wanted to keep it simple, just close friends and immediate family." Immediate family. The words stung because they made it clear that I was no longer considered immediate family in my son's life. "Why wasn't I invited, David? Why didn't you even tell me you were getting married?" His explanation was worse than no explanation at all. "Mom, you know how you and Miranda are. You two just don't really click." And she was already stressed about the wedding planning. "We thought it would be easier for everyone if we kept it small and didn't complicate things with family drama." Family drama. As if my presence at my son's wedding would have been drama rather than the natural, expected, loving support of a mother for her child. "I would never have caused drama, David," I said, tears starting to flow despite my efforts to stay composed. "I just wanted to be there for your special day. I wanted to see you get married, to meet Miranda's family, to be part of this important moment in your life." But even as I said the words, I could feel him pulling away, could hear Miranda's voice in the background asking who he was talking to and why it was taking so long. "Look, Mom, what's done is done," David said, his tone becoming increasingly impatient. "The wedding is over. We're married now, and arguing about guest lists isn't going to change anything. Miranda and I are happy. happy, and that's what matters. Thought you'd be happy for us too? The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. By questioning why I hadn't been invited, I was somehow being unsupportive of his happiness rather than justifiably hurt by my exclusion. Of course I'm happy for you, I said, though the words felt like broken glass in my throat. I just don't understand why getting married had to mean cutting me out of your life. But David's response showed me just how completely Miranda had succeeded in reframing our relationship in his mind. You're being dramatic. We're not cutting you out of our lives. We're just starting our marriage the way we want to start it, without a lot of outside pressure and expectations. You'll understand when you meet Miranda properly and see how good she is for me. Meet Miranda properly. As if I were some distant relative who needed to be gradually introduced to the family rather than his mother, who had every right to be involved. In his major life decisions, the call ended with David promising to call soon and explain everything better when they got back from their honeymoon. But the damage was done. My son had gotten married without telling me, had celebrated the most important day of his adult life without his mother present, and had somehow been convinced that excluding me was reasonable and justified. I sat on my deck surrounded by the broken pieces of my coffee cup and the shattered pieces of my heart, wondering how I'd lost my relationship with my son so completely without even realizing it was happening. But even in that moment of devastating grief, a small voice in the back of my mind was asking questions that would become very important in the days to come. How had David afforded the elaborate wedding I'd seen in the photos? How had Miranda managed to plan such an extensive celebration while working as a part-time yoga instructor? And most importantly, why had they tagged me in the photos if they hadn't wanted me to know about the wedding? The answers to those questions would soon become clear, and when they did, my heartbreak would transform into something much more powerful and dangerous. 3 days after discovering my son's secret wedding through social media, I was still in a state of emotional shock when my phone rang at 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning. I'd barely slept since seeing those Facebook photos, spending my nights walking the moonlit shores of Lake Windermere and trying to understand how my relationship with David had deteriorated so completely without my awareness. When I saw his name on the caller ID, my heart leaped with hope that maybe he was calling to apologize, to explain, to somehow make this devastating situation right. "Hi, Mom," David said, his voice bright and cheerful as if nothing unusual had happened between us. "How are you doing? It's a beautiful morning, isn't it?" The casual tone was jarring after 3 days of silence following the most hurtful experience of my life. He was speaking to me like we'd chatted just yesterday, like he hadn't excluded me from his wedding and then dismissed my pain when I'd called to ask why. "I'm managing," I said carefully, unsure whether this was going to be the apology I'd been hoping for or something else entirely. "How are you and Miranda settling into married life?" I tried to keep my voice neutral though. Every word felt like it was being dragged through broken glass. Part of me was desperate to maintain whatever connection I still had with my son, even if it meant pretending that his treatment of me had been acceptable. "That's actually why I'm calling," David said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Miranda and I have been talking about our honeymoon plans, and we've decided we want to spend it at the lake house. You know how much we both love it there, and it would be so romantic to have 2 weeks of complete privacy and beautiful scenery. Plus, it would save us a fortune compared to going to some expensive resort." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the phone pressed against my ear as I tried to process what I was hearing. "You want to spend your honeymoon at my house?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The audacity was breathtaking. After excluding me from their wedding, after making it clear that I wasn't considered close enough family to witness their marriage, they now wanted to use my property for their romantic getaway. "Well, it's not exactly your house, is it, Mom?" David said with a laugh that held no warmth. "I mean, it's the family lake house. Dad always said it would belong to all of us someday, and Miranda and I are family now. It just makes sense that we'd want to celebrate our marriage in a place that's so special to our family history." The rewriting of ownership and family hierarchy was stunning. My lake house, which I'd been paying for and maintaining for 15 years, was now somehow communal property that he and his new wife had a right to use. I could hear Miranda's voice, in the background, sharp and demanding, though I couldn't make out the specific words. David's voice became muffled as he covered the phone to respond to her, then came back on the line with a list of requirements that made my blood pressure spike. "Miranda wants to know if you could have the house professionally cleaned before we arrive and maybe stock the kitchen with some basics, champagne, steaks, that kind of thing. Oh, and she's wondering about the boat. You still have the pontoon boat, right? We'll want to use that for sunset cruises." The entitlement was staggering. Not only did they want to use my house for their honeymoon after excluding me from their wedding. They wanted me to prepare it for them like I was running a bed and breakfast. David, I said, my voice getting stronger as my shock transformed into anger. Are you seriously asking me to clean and stock my house so you can have a honeymoon thereafter? Not inviting me to your wedding? Mom, don't be like that, David said, his tone becoming slightly impatient. We've already told all our friends about the amazing lake house where we're going to spend our honeymoon. Miranda's been posting photos of the property on her Instagram, talking about how excited she is to relax at the family estate. If we have to change plans now, it's going to be really embarrassing for both of us. Family estate. My modest but beautiful lake house had somehow been transformed in their minds into a grand family estate that they had inherent rights to use. When exactly were you planning to arrive? I asked, though I was already beginning to formulate a response that would shock them. As much as their wedding exclusion had shocked me, this Friday afternoon, David said cheerfully. We'll probably get there around 4 or 5 depending on traffic. Miranda's really excited to finally spend some quality time at the lake house. She's been wanting to experience it properly ever since I first told her about it. Quality time at the lake house. As if she were some long-awaited family member finally getting her chance to enjoy a beloved family retreat, rather than the woman who had orchestrated my exclusion from my son's wedding. I could hear Miranda's voice becoming more insistent in the background, and David covered the phone again for another muffled conversation. When he came back, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike. Oh, and Mom, Miranda wants to know about the master bedroom. She's assuming we'll have the lake-facing room with a private balcony. That makes sense for a honeymoon, right? And she's wondering if you could maybe stay somewhere else while we're there. She thinks it might be awkward having you around during our romantic time. Stay somewhere else while they used my house for their honeymoon. After excluding me from their wedding, the progression from entitlement to outright audacity was remarkable. David, I said slowly, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You want me to clean my house, stock it with food and champagne, and then leave so you and Miranda can have a private honeymoon in my home. Is that right? When you put it like that, it sounds kind of harsh, David said with an uncomfortable laugh. But yeah, basically, Mom, this is really important to us. It's our honeymoon, and we want it to be perfect. The lake house is the ideal spot, and having you there would just make things complicated. Miranda's already planned out all these romantic activities, sunset dinners, morning swims, that kind of thing. It would be weird having my mom around for all that. The casual cruelty of his words was stunning. I wasn't just being excluded from their honeymoon, I was being told that my presence in my own home would be weird and unwelcome. And where exactly am I supposed to stay while you're using my house? I asked, though I was already planning a response that would make this entire conversation moot. I don't know. Maybe Helen would let you stay with her for a couple weeks. Or you could get a hotel room in town. Think of it as a little vacation for yourself while we have our honeymoon. It works out well for everyone. A hotel room. They used my lake house for free after excluding me from their wedding. The level of entitlement was beyond anything I'd experienced in 7 decades of life. Miranda's voice became clearly audible in the background, and this time I could make out her words. Tell her we need the boat keys too, and ask if she knows where the good fishing spots are. And find out if there's Wi-Fi in all the bedrooms because I want to live stream some of our honeymoon activities for my followers. Live stream activities in my house for her social media followers while I paid for a hotel room to avoid being weird during their romantic celebration. Did you hear that, Mom? David asked. Miranda has some great ideas for making the most of our time there. This is going to be such an amazing experience for us, and we really appreciate you making it possible. Making it possible, as if I were generously facilitating their honeymoon, rather than being strong-armed into providing free luxury accommodations after being excluded from their wedding. David, I said, my voice becoming very calm and controlled in a way that would have warned anyone who knew me well that they'd pushed too far. I need to think about this request. Can I call you back in a day or two with my answer? The question seemed to surprise him, as if my agreement to their demands was so obvious that discussion wasn't necessary. Well, yeah, I guess, he said hesitantly. But Mom, we really need to know soon because Miranda wants to finalize our plans. And honestly, I can't imagine why you'd say no. It's not like you use the lake house that much anyway. And this is our honeymoon we're talking about. This is important. Not like I used the lake house that much. The home I'd been living in full-time since retiring. It's the property I maintained and loved and had made into my sanctuary. It's apparently underutilized specialized in their opinion. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking out at the lake that had brought me peace for so many years and felt something shift inside me. The grief and confusion I'd been experiencing since discovering David's secret wedding was crystallizing into something much clearer and more powerful. My son and his new wife had shown me exactly how they viewed me and what they thought I was worth to them. They saw me as a resource to be used when convenient and dismissed when not needed. A woman whose feelings didn't matter as long as her property was available for their enjoyment. But what David and Miranda didn't know, what they'd never bothered to learn despite years of relationship, was that the woman they were trying to manipulate and exploit had resources and determination they'd never imagined. The lake house they wanted to commandeer for their honeymoon was worth $3.2 million and was just one part of an $8 million estate that I'd built through careful planning and smart investments. And the mother they'd excluded from their wedding was about to teach them a lesson about respect, consequences, and the dangerous assumption that family love meant unlimited access to whatever they wanted. I walked out onto my deck, looking at the pristine lake and the beautiful property that David and Miranda thought they could simply claim for their honeymoon, and began planning a response that would be every bit as shocking to them as their wedding exclusion had been to me. Wanted to use my house after excluding me from their wedding? You were about to discover that some requests come with consequences they never saw coming. As I sat on my deck that evening, watching the sunset paint Lake Windermere in shades of gold and crimson, I found myself thinking back over the past 2 years and wondering how I'd missed the signs of Miranda's systematic campaign to isolate me from David's life. What I'd initially attributed to the natural adjustment period of a new relationship had actually been a carefully orchestrated effort to marginalize me in my son's life while positioning herself as his primary family connection. The exclusion had started subtly, gradually, that I'd convinced myself I was being overly sensitive or reading too much into innocent circumstances. The first red flag should have been David's sudden cancellation of our traditional monthly dinners together, a ritual we'd maintained since he'd moved out at 22. Mom, Miranda and I have been invited to this amazing dinner party, he'd explained apologetically. So it's some of her colleagues from the yoga studio, and it could be really good for her career. You understand, right? I'd understood, of course, 'cause I'd wanted to be the supportive mother who didn't make demands or create complications. But the cancellations had multiplied, each one accompanied by explanations that made me feel selfish for wanting to maintain our relationship. Miranda's family was visiting from out of state and needed David's attention. Miranda was going through a difficult time at work and needed emotional support. Miranda had planned a surprise weekend getaway that couldn't be rescheduled. Always Miranda's needs, Miranda's schedule. Miranda's priorities taking precedence over the relationship I'd had with my son for 34 years. The phone calls had changed too, though so subtly that I hadn't recognized the manipulation until now. Our weekly Sunday conversations, a tradition that had lasted through David's college years, his various jobs, and his previous relationships, suddenly became sporadic and rushed. Sorry, Mom, can I call you back later? Miranda and I are heading out to meet some friends became a constant refrain. The callbacks rarely came, and when they did, they were brief, distracted, with Miranda's voice always audible in the background, reminding David of somewhere they needed to be or something they needed to do. But perhaps the most insidious change was how David had started speaking about me to others. I learned this from my sister Helen, whose daughter lived in David City and had encountered him at a neighborhood gathering. Dorothy, Helen had told me hesitantly during one of our conversations, I don't want to cause trouble, but Sarah mentioned that David told people his mother was going through a difficult adjustment to retirement and struggling with loneliness. She was concerned and asked if there was anything the family could do to help. Struggling with loneliness, going through a difficult adjustment. Miranda had apparently been coaching David to portray me as a pathetic figure whose calls and invitations were symptoms of my inability to create my own fulfilling life rather than the natural desire of a mother to maintain a relationship with her adult child. The narrative was brilliant in its simplicity. I wasn't being excluded. I was being protected from my own neediness and desperation. What made this manipulation particularly painful was how it had affected my relationship with David's friends and colleagues, people I'd known for years. At the few social gatherings I'd been included in during the early days of David's relationship with Miranda, I'd noticed a subtle shift in how people interacted with me. Conversations that had once been natural and warm became careful and slightly patronizing, as if they were speaking to someone fragile who needed to be handled delicately. Mrs. Patterson, recent "How are you adjusting to retirement?" had become the standard greeting, delivered with a kind of concerned tone usually reserved for people recovering from illness or trauma. "Are you keeping busy? You've made new friends in your area?" The questions were well-meaning but revealed that David had been portraying me as isolated and struggling rather than as a confident, financially secure woman who'd chosen early retirement to pursue her interests and enjoy her beautiful lake house. But what Miranda didn't know, what David had apparently never bothered to tell her despite 2 years of relationship, was that his mother wasn't the struggling lonely widow she'd assumed she was dealing with. Richard's life insurance policy and my own careful investments had left me with an estate worth approximately $8 million, including the lake house that was now worth $3.2 million, 3 rental properties in the city, and a diversified investment portfolio that generated more monthly income than David made in 6 months at his engineering job. The lake house alone represented 15 years of careful planning and financial management. I'd purchased the property for $800,000 shortly after Richard's death, using it initially as a weekend retreat before deciding to make it my primary residence when I retired at 65. Over the years, I'd invested another $400,000 in renovations and improvements, creating a showcase property with every modern amenity, while maintaining the rustic charm that made it so special. The irony was devastating. While Miranda was positioning herself as David's protector against his supposedly needy mother, she was systematically cutting him off from a woman who could have made their financial lives significantly easier. They'd simply treated her with respect and inclusion. The wedding they'd planned without telling me, the elaborate celebration I'd seen in those Facebook photos, had probably stretched their budget to the breaking point. While I sat alone at my lake house with more than enough resources to have hosted the event of their dreams, but Miranda's manipulation went beyond just isolating me from David's daily life. I was beginning to realize that she'd been actively researching my financial situation and property holdings, probably planning for the inheritance she assumed would eventually come her way. 3 months ago, I'd received a call from a real estate agent asking if I'd be interested in selling the lake house, claiming that a client was specifically interested in waterfront properties in my area. When I declined and asked how they'd gotten my information, the agent had mentioned that a family member had suggested I might be ready to downsize. Similarly, I'd noticed increased activity from financial services companies with cold calls and mailings about estate planning, reverse mortgages, and senior living communities. Someone had been giving out my contact information and portraying me as an elderly woman who might be ready to liquidate assets or transition to assisted living. The timing and frequency of these contacts had increased significantly since David's relationship with Miranda had become serious. The pieces were falling into place with disturbing clarity. Miranda hadn't just been isolating me from David's social life. She'd been building a narrative about my declining capabilities and increasing neediness that would justify their eventual control over my assets. The exclusion from the wedding wasn't just about avoiding family drama. It was about establishing a pattern where I was treated as peripheral to their lives while maintaining access to my resources when they needed them. The lake house request wasn't an innocent honeymoon plan. It was a test run for the kind of access they expected to have to my property and resources as their marriage progressed. Miranda wanted to establish precedent, to create a situation where using my home for their convenience became normalized rather than questioned. The demand that I leave during their stay wasn't just about privacy. It was about making it clear that my presence in my own home was subject to their approval and their schedule. But what Miranda had failed to understand in her careful manipulation was that financial independence creates options that desperation never provides. The woman she'd been systematically undermining and excluding wasn't dependent on David's approval or attention for her happiness or security. I had my own life, my own resources, and my own capacity to make decisions that would shock people who'd underestimated me as the last light faded over Lake Windermere and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. I made a decision that felt both necessary and liberating. David and Miranda had shown me exactly how they viewed me and what they thought I was worth to them. They'd excluded me from their wedding while planning to use my property for their honeymoon. They'd isolated me from David's life while researching ways to access my assets. They'd treated me like a resource to be managed rather than a person deserving respect and inclusion. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed that because I was 71 and living alone, I would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and inclusion they were were willing to provide. They'd assumed that my love for David would make me accept any treatment, tolerate any disrespect, enable any manipulation as long as it meant maintaining some connection to my son. They were about to discover that some assumptions about elderly women and their supposed desperation for family connection could be very, very wrong. The honeymoon they'd planned at my lake house was about to become a lesson in consequences, respect, and the dangerous mistake of underestimating someone based on their age and circumstances. The morning after David's audacious honeymoon request, I made a decision that felt both necessary and slightly surreal. At 71, I was about to hire a private investigator to look into my own son's marriage and financial situation. But something about Miranda's confident assumption that she could use my property, combined with the systematic way I'd been excluded from David's life, suggested that there were layers to this situation I didn't understand. I called Patricia Chen, an investigator I'd worked with years ago when I'd suspected one of my rental property tenants was subletting illegally. "Dorothy," Patricia said warmly when I explained what I needed, "I have to say, this is one of the more unusual family situations I've been asked to investigate. But based on what you're describing, I think your instincts are correct. The level of entitlement and manipulation you're seeing suggests there might be financial motivations that go beyond normal family dynamics." She agreed to look into David and Miranda's financial situation, their wedding expenses, and any legal research Miranda might have done regarding property rights or inheritance law. While Patricia began her investigation, I decided to do some research of my own. Miranda's social media presence was extensive and surprisingly revealing once I started looking at it with a critical eye. Her Instagram account, which had over 5,000 followers, painted a picture of a lifestyle that seemed far beyond the means of a part-time yoga instructor. Designer clothes, expensive restaurant meals, luxury spa treatments, weekend trips to high-end resorts, all documented with the kind of casual confidence that suggested unlimited financial resources. But it was her Facebook posts about David that really caught my attention. Instead of the typical couple photos and affectionate messages I'd expected, Miranda's posts consistently portrayed David as her financial provider and herself as his grateful recipient. "So lucky to have a man who takes care of everything." Read one caption under a photo of them at an expensive steakhouse. "When your amazing fiancé surprises you with a spa weekend because you've been working so hard." Read another, accompanied by pictures of a resort that probably costs more than most people's monthly salary. The comments on these posts were particularly revealing. Friends and family members consistently praised David for his generosity and Miranda for finding such a good provider. There were references to the amazing wedding David was planning and the gorgeous lake house where they'd be honeymooning. Miranda had been building a public narrative about David's wealth and her access to family resources, creating expectations among their social circle that would be difficult to walk back if circumstances changed. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a blog Miranda had been writing called "Marrying into Money: A Modern Guide to Financial Security Through Love." The blog, which had been active for over a year, provided advice to women about identifying and attracting financially stable men, with particular emphasis on men whose families had generational wealth or property holdings. The posts were written with the clinical detachment of a business strategy rather than the emotional investment of someone genuinely in love. Know your target's family dynamics. Read one particularly chilling post. "Older family members, especially widowed mothers, can be either your greatest asset or your biggest obstacle. The key is to position yourself as the protective daughter-in-law while gradually demonstrating that the older generation's involvement is unnecessary and potentially harmful to your partner's independence and growth." Another post titled "Property, Rights, and Marriage: Securing Your Future" contained detailed research about inheritance laws, community property rights, and the legal procedures for challenging elderly family members' control over assets. Miranda had clearly been treating her relationship with David as a business venture, with my lake house and financial resources as the ultimate prize to be won through careful manipulation and strategic planning. Patricia's investigation, completed 3 days later, painted an even more disturbing picture of Miranda's motivations and methods. "Dorothy, your son's new wife, has over $200,000 in student loan debt, stout credit cards totaling another $80,000, and has been unemployed for the past 6 months despite claiming to work as a yoga instructor," Patricia explained during our meeting at her office. "She's been living entirely off David's income and credit while researching legal strategies for accessing family wealth. The wedding I'd seen in those Facebook photos had cost approximately $75,000, funded entirely through loans and credit cards that David had apparently co-signed without understanding the full financial implications. Your son thinks they spent $15,000 on a modest celebration, Patricia continued. Miranda has been hiding the true costs from him while planning for the lake house honeymoon as a way to demonstrate their access to family resources to their friends and her social media followers. But the most shocking revelation was evidence that Miranda had been actively sabotaging my relationship with David for over a year. Phone records showed that she'd been intercepting my calls and text messages, responding on David's behalf with excuses and delays. She's been using his phone to cancel plans with you, decline invitations, and even send messages that made you think David was too busy or uninterested to maintain regular contact, Carissa explained. The systematic nature of the deception was breathtaking. Miranda had been creating a false narrative for both David and me, convincing him that I was becoming needy and demanding, while convincing me that he was becoming distant and uninterested in our relationship. She'd manufactured the very isolation and misunderstanding that had made her wedding exclusion possible, and my current confusion about David's behavior seem reasonable. There's more, Patricia said, pulling out another folder. Miranda has been in contact with several elder law attorneys over the past 6 months, asking about the legal procedures for gaining conservatorship over elderly family members who may be experiencing cognitive decline. She's been researching the requirements for having someone declared incompetent and the process for taking legal control of their assets. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. Miranda hadn't just been planning to use my lake house for their honeymoon. She'd been developing a long-term strategy for gaining control of my entire estate. The exclusion from their wedding wasn't just about avoiding family drama. It was about establishing a pattern of isolation that could later be used as evidence that I was becoming disconnected from reality and in need of professional care. Dorothy, what you're dealing with isn't just a difficult daughter-in-law, Patricia said grimly. This is a systematic campaign of elder financial abuse that's been planned and executed over more than a year. Miranda has been researching legal vulnerabilities, isolating you from your son, and building a public narrative about your declining capabilities that could be used to justify taking control of your assets. The scope of Miranda's deception and planning was staggering, but it also explained everything that had been confusing me about David's behavior over the past 2 years. He hadn't been choosing Miranda over me. He'd been manipulated into believing that I was becoming a burden while being isolated from information that would have contradicted that narrative. The son I'd raised was still there, buried under layers of lies and manipulation that had been carefully constructed to serve Miranda's financial goals, but Miranda had made one crucial miscalculation in her elaborate scheme. She'd assumed that because I was 71 and living alone, I would be easy to isolate, manipulate, and eventually control. She'd treated me like a typical elderly victim of financial abuse, someone who would be grateful for any attention and too confused or intimidated to fight back effectively. What she was about to discover was that the woman she'd been systematically undermining and excluding wasn't a vulnerable elderly person in need of protection. I was a financially independent, legally sophisticated, strategically minded woman who'd just been given detailed evidence of a criminal conspiracy aimed at stealing my life's work and destroying my family relationships. The honeymoon they'd planned at my lake house was about to become the opening move in a much larger game, one where Miranda would discover that she'd seriously underestimated her opponent and the consequences of treating family relationships as business opportunities to be exploited for financial gain. Armed with Patricia's investigation results and a crystal clear understanding of Miranda's systematic campaign against me, I spent the next day crafting a response that would be both legally bulletproof and emotionally devastating. This wasn't going to be a simple refusal of their honeymoon request. This was going to be a complete dismantling of Miranda's carefully constructed plans. It's got a wake-up call for my son about the woman he'd married. But first, I needed to ensure that every aspect of my response was properly documented and legally sound. I called my attorney, Robert Martinez, who had been handling my estate planning and property matters for over a decade. Robert, I said, settling into his downtown office with copies of all the evidence Patricia had gathered. I need your help with what might be the most important legal strategy of my life. My daughter-in-law has been planning to steal my assets, and I want to make sure my response protects both my property and my relationship with my son. Robert reviewed the evidence with the methodical attention of someone who'd who'd seen too many cases of elder financial abuse. Dorothy, what you're showing me constitutes criminal conspiracy, fraud, and attempted elder abuse. This Miranda woman has been planning systematic theft while manipulating your son into being an unwitting accomplice. We need to document everything and create a response that exposes her crimes while protecting you from any future legal challenges. The first step was securing my property legally. Robert drafted new estate documents that specifically excluded Miranda from any inheritance rights and included detailed provisions preventing anyone who had attempted to manipulate or defraud me from benefiting from my estate. If David chooses to stay married to her after learning the truth, he'll still inherit, but Miranda will never see a penny of your money. Robert explained. Next, we established a comprehensive security system for the lake house, hired Lakeside Security Services to install cameras, motion sensors, and electronic locks that could be controlled remotely. Mrs. Patterson, the installation supervisor, explained. This system will document anyone who attempts to enter your property without permission. If they try to claim they have rights to be there, you'll have video evidence to the contrary. But the most important element of my strategy was the letter itself. Robert and I spent hours crafting a response that would be devastating in its completeness, while remaining legally unassailable. Dorothy, this letter needs to accomplish several things simultaneously, Robert explained. It needs to deny their honeymoon request, expose Miranda's deception, reveal your true financial situation, and give David a clear choice between his manipulative wife and his mother. I also decided to involve my extended family in the revelation. Helen, my sister, deserved to know what had been happening, especially since she'd been deceived by Miranda's narrative about my supposed loneliness and mental decline. Helen, I said during our phone call, I need you to come up to the lake house this weekend. There's something happening with David's marriage that affects our entire family, and I want you to understand the full situation. My nephew Michael, who worked in social media marketing, provided crucial advice about documenting everything for potential legal proceedings. And Dorothy, you need to screenshot all of Miranda's social media posts, especially the ones about the lake house and her blog about marrying for money. This kind of evidence can disappear quickly once people realize they're in legal trouble. Patricia Chen suggested one final element that would make my response particularly effective. Dorothy, Miranda has been building her social media presence around the idea of access to your family's wealth. Oh, what if we arrange for some of her followers and friends to witness the reality of her situation? Nothing illegal or unethical, just making sure that when her plans fall apart, it happens as publicly as she's been promising success. The strategy was comprehensive and devastating. Miranda would arrive expecting to use my lake house for her honeymoon, only to find herself locked out, exposed, and facing potential criminal charges. David would learn the truth about his wife's manipulation and deception, giving him the choice to either stand with his mother or continue enabling a woman who'd been systematically lying to both of us. Robert, there's one more thing I want to include. I said as we finalized the letter, I want to offer David a path back to our relationship, but only if he's willing to acknowledge what's been done and work to repair the damage. Miranda has poisoned our family dynamic, but my son is still my son, and I won't let her destroy that permanently if he's willing to fight for it. The letter we crafted was a masterpiece of legal precision and emotional impact. It would deny their honeymoon request while exposing every lie Miranda had told, every manipulation she'd attempted, and every crime she'd planned. It would reveal my true financial situation while making it clear that her access to my resources was permanently terminated. And it would give David irrefutable evidence of who his wife really was and what she'd been planning for his family. Dorothy, Robert said as we finished the final draft, this letter is going to change everything. Once you send this, there's no going back. Miranda's schemes will be exposed. David will have to choose between his wife and his mother, and your family dynamics will never be the same. Are you prepared for all the consequences that might follow? I thought about the past 2 years of systematic isolation, the wedding I'd been excluded from, the audacious demand to use my property while being treated like an inconvenience. I thought about Miranda's blog posts about marrying for money, her research into elder abuse techniques, and her plans to have me declare declared incompetent. Most importantly, I thought about my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father's death, who was being manipulated and lied to by a woman who saw him only as a pathway to financial security. Robert, I'm not just prepared for the consequences, I said firmly. I'm counting on them. Miranda has spent 2 years systematically destroying my relationship with David while planning to steal everything I've worked for. She's treated my love for my son as a weakness to be exploited and my age as evidence of vulnerability to be targeted. She's about to discover that she's made a very serious miscalculation about who she's been trying to manipulate. The letter was scheduled for delivery on Thursday morning, exactly 24 hours before David and Miranda expected to arrive at my lake house for their honeymoon. By the time they received it, the security system would be active, the locks would be changed, and the property would be under 24-hour surveillance. Their romantic getaway was about to become a very public lesson in the consequences of treating family relationships as business opportunities and elderly relatives as resources to be harvested. But more importantly, my son was about to learn the truth about the woman he'd married and the mother he'd been manipulated into abandoning. The choice he made in response to that truth would determine not just his future with Miranda, but his relationship with me for the rest of our lives. The letter I sent to David and Miranda on Thursday morning was delivered by certified mail to ensure there would be legal documentation of when they received it. I'd spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting every word, balancing my fury at Miranda's deception with my love for David and my hope that he could still be saved from the manipulative woman who'd been systematically destroying our family. The envelope was thick, containing not just my response to their honeymoon request, but copies of all the evidence Patricia had gathered about Miranda's true motivations and criminal planning. Dear David and Miranda, the letter began. I am writing in response to your request to use my lake house for your honeymoon. After careful consideration of your circumstances and your recent treatment of me, I must respectfully decline. However, this letter contains information that I believe will help you both understand why your request is not only inappropriate, but reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of our family relationships and my personal circumstances. I decided to address them both directly, making it impossible for Miranda to intercept the letter or control how David received the information. The next section revealed the true scope of my financial situation, something I'd kept private for decades, but which had become necessary to expose Miranda's mercenary motivations. David, there are things about our family's financial situation that your father and I chose never to discuss with you because we wanted you to develop your own work ethic and sense of accomplishment. However, recent events have made it necessary for you to understand the truth. Your mother is not a struggling widow living on Social Security. I am worth approximately $8 million, including this lake house, which is valued at $3.2 million. My monthly investment income exceeds $30,000. And I chose early retirement not out of necessity, but because I had the financial freedom to pursue my interests. The revelation was designed to shock David while simultaneously destroying Miranda's narrative about my supposed neediness and her role as his protector against an elderly mother's unreasonable demands. The next section addressed Miranda directly, exposing her systematic campaign of manipulation and deception. Miranda, I am aware of your blog Marrying into Money, your research into elder law and conservatorship procedures, and your systematic campaign to isolate me from my son's life. I know about your $280,000 in debt, your unemployment, and your use of David's credit to fund a lifestyle neither of you can afford. I also know that you have been intercepting my communications with David and building a false narrative about my mental health to justify your long-term plans for accessing my assets. I'd included specific examples of her manipulation tactics, complete with dates and documentation that would be impossible for her to deny or explain away. The letter detailed how she'd been responding to my calls and texts on David's behalf, how she'd been spreading rumors about my supposed cognitive decline, and how she'd been researching legal strategies for gaining control of elderly relatives' assets. The wedding from which I was excluded was not a small, intimate ceremony as David was told to believe. According to my investigation, cost $75,000 and was funded entirely through loans and credit cards that David co-signed without understanding the true financial implications. The exclusion of his mother was not about avoiding family drama. It was about establishing a pattern of isolation that could later be used as evidence of my disconnection from reality. The section addressing their honeymoon request was particularly devastating, revealing not just my refusal, but the legal consequences of their continued continued attempts to access my property without permission. Your request to use my lake house for your honeymoon, complete with demands that I clean, stock, and vacate my own home for your convenience, demonstrates a level of entitlement that is both shocking and legally concerning. This request, combined with your systematic research into my assets and your documented plans for future exploitation, constitutes attempted elder financial abuse under state and federal law. I'd included copies of all the relevant legal statutes, making it clear that Miranda's behavior wasn't just morally reprehensible, but potentially criminal. The letter outlined the specific charges she could face if she continued her campaign of manipulation and deception. Effective immediately, Miranda Collins Patterson is permanently banned from my property. Any attempt to enter, use, or claim rights to my lake house or any other assets will result in immediate prosecution for trespassing, attempted theft, and elder abuse. This property is now under 24-hour security surveillance, and all access attempts will be documented for legal proceedings. But the most important section of the letter was addressed directly to David, offering him a path back to our relationship while making clear the choice he would have to make about his marriage. David, you are still my son, and I still love you, despite the pain that Miranda's manipulation has caused to our relationship. However, I will no longer enable or tolerate the systematic abuse that has been perpetrated against me under the guise of your marriage. You have been lied to about my circumstances, my mental health, and my feelings toward your relationship. You have been used as an unwitting accomplice in a campaign designed to isolate me from your life while positioning your wife to eventually gain control of my assets. The letter offered David specific evidence he could verify independently, including phone records, social media posts, and legal documents that would prove Miranda's deception beyond any doubt. I am providing you with all the evidence I have gathered, not to destroy your marriage, but to ensure that any decisions you make about your future are based on truth rather than the lies Miranda has been telling both of us. The final section: establish clear boundaries for any future relationship between us, making it impossible for Miranda to continue her manipulation while offering David a genuine opportunity for reconciliation. If you choose to remain married to Miranda after learning the truth about her deception, that is your decision to make as an adult. However, our relationship going forward will be contingent on your acknowledgement of what has been done to me and your commitment to ensuring it never happens again. I will not be excluded, manipulated, or treated as a resource to be managed. Rather than a mother to be loved and respected, the letter concluded with a deadline that would force immediate consequences for their honeymoon plans while giving David time to process the information and make his choice. You were planning to arrive at my lake house tomorrow for your honeymoon. Instead, you will find the property secured and inaccessible. I suggest you use this time to verify the information I have provided and decide what kind of relationships you want to have with the people in your life. The choice between truth and deception, between respect and exploitation, between family and fraud is now yours to make. I'd included my attorney's contact information and a clear statement that any attempts to dispute the letter's contents or challenge my property rights would result in immediate legal action. The package also contained copies of Miranda's own writings about marrying for money, her research into elder abuse techniques, and evidence of her systematic deception about everything from her employment status to her true feelings about our family. When I dropped the certified letter at the post office Thursday morning, felt a mixture of dread and liberation that I'd never experienced before. In 24 hours, David would learn the truth about the woman he'd married and the mother he'd been manipulated into abandoning. Miranda would discover that her carefully constructed plans had been exposed and that her target was far more formidable than she'd ever imagined. The honeymoon they'd planned as a symbol of their access to family wealth was about to become a very public demonstration of the consequences of treating elderly relatives as resources to be exploited in family relationships, as business opportunities to be manipulated for financial gain. Tomorrow would determine not just the future of David's marriage, but whether the son I'd raised and loved could be saved from the woman who had been systematically destroying our family while planning to steal everything I'd worked to build. Friday afternoon arrived with a kind of perfect weather that would have made for an ideal honeymoon at a lakefront property. The honeymooners had actually been welcome at the property in question. I spent the morning at my sister Helen's house in town, watching the security cameras on my phone as the drama I'd orchestrated began to unfold. At exactly 4:17 p.m., David's silver Honda pulled into my driveway, followed closely by a white BMW that I didn't recognize. Through the crystal clear security footage, I could see David and Miranda stepping out of their car, both dressed in casual vacation clothes and carrying overnight bags with the confident air of people arriving at their expected destination. The first sign that something was wrong came when David tried his old key in the front door. I watched him jiggle the key, try it again, and then step back with a confused expression. Miranda appeared beside him, her voice clearly audible through the security system's audio feed. "What's wrong? Why isn't it working?" Her tone was already sharp with irritation, as if a malfunctioning key was a personal insult rather than the first indication that their plans weren't going to proceed as expected. "I don't know," David replied, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose fundamental assumptions about the world were being challenged. "This key has always worked. Maybe Mom changed the locks for security reasons." He was still trying to find innocent explanations for what was happening, still operating under the assumption that his mother was a predictable element in his life. Who wouldn't dare disrupt his carefully laid plans? Miranda pulled out her phone and began taking photos of the house, the locked doors, and David's unsuccessful attempts to gain entry. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising with each word. "We told everyone we were coming here for our honeymoon. I have 15 people expecting to see posts from the family estate. This is completely unacceptable." The reference to the family estate would have been laughable if it weren't so perfectly illustrative of her entitled attitude toward property she'd never had any right to use. The white BMW turned out to contain two of Miranda's friends, Stephanie and Rachel, who had apparently been invited to document the luxurious honeymoon setting for social media purposes. They emerged from their car with professional camera equipment and the kind of excitement that suggested they'd been promised access to something impressive. "Miranda, this place is even more gorgeous than in the photos," Stephanie called out, apparently unaware that they wouldn't be getting inside to take the planned content. David tried calling my phone, and I watched through the security cameras as he paced the driveway with increasing agitation. When the call went to voicemail, he left a message that was equal parts confusion and frustration. "Mom, it's David. We're here at the lake house, but the key isn't working. Did you change the locks? Can you call me back? We have people here for the honeymoon, and we really need to get inside." But it was Miranda's reaction that provided the most entertaining aspect of the unfolding disaster. As it became clear that they weren't going to gain easy access to the house, her carefully maintained facade of sweet reasonableness began to crack. "David, call your mother right now and demand that she get over here to let us in," she ordered, her voice taking on the sharp edge of someone who was used to getting her way through intimidation and manipulation. "Miranda, maybe something happened," David said, his natural inclination still being to find reasonable explanations for unreasonable situations. There was an emergency, or maybe she forgot we were coming today." His loyalty to me, even after 2 years of systematic manipulation, was touching and gave me hope that our relationship could still be salvaged once he learned the truth about his wife. "She didn't forget," Miranda snapped, pulling out her own phone to make a call. "This is deliberate, and it's completely unacceptable. We have every right to be here. This is family property, and I'm family now." The call she made was apparently to my number, and I listened through the security system as she left a voicemail that revealed the true nature of her character when her manipulative charm failed to achieve its intended results. "Dorothy, is Miranda your daughter-in-law?" she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness that fooled no one. "We're at the lake house for our honeymoon, as we discussed, and we seem to be locked out. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, but we have guests here who are expecting to see the property, and this situation is becoming quite embarrassing. Please call us immediately so we can resolve this." Stephanie and Rachel were becoming increasingly confused as the situation deteriorated. "Are we not going inside?" Rachel asked, her professional camera hanging uselessly around her neck. "I thought we were here to take content for your honeymoon series." The reference to a honeymoon series suggested that Miranda had been planning to monetize their stay at my property, probably through sponsored social media posts and affiliate marketing to her followers. As the afternoon stretched into evening, without any response from me, the group's mood shifted from confusion to frustration to something approaching panic. Miranda's social media followers were expecting luxury honeymoon content from the family estate, and instead she was standing in a driveway, locked out of a house she'd never actually had permission to use. The gap between her promises and her reality was becoming impossible to hide. David tried several more approaches to gaining entry, including checking windows and attempting to contact neighbors who who might have spare keys. Each failed attempt seemed to diminish his confidence in his understanding of the situation. "This doesn't make sense," he kept repeating. "Mom knew we were coming. She wouldn't just lock us out without explanation." But Miranda was already moving into damage control mode, trying to spin the situation for her social media audience. "Sometimes family properties require special arrangements," she posted on Instagram, along with a photo of the lake house exterior. "Working on access issues, but look at this gorgeous location." The comments from her followers were immediate and pointed. "Why can't you get inside? Whose house is this, really? Are you actually allowed to be there?" The most devastating moment came when a second car arrived, this one containing Miranda's parents, who had apparently been invited to witness their daughter's luxurious honeymoon accommodations. I watched through the security cameras as an older couple emerged from a modest sedan, clearly dressed in their best clothes for what they'd been led to believe would be a tour of their daughter's access to family wealth. "Miranda, dear, why are you all standing outside?" her mother asked, her voice carrying the confusion of someone whose expectations had been completely undermined. "You said we'd be able to see the beautiful house where you're staying for your honeymoon." The disappointment in her voice was palpable, and I almost felt sorry for these people who'd been deceived by their daughters. Elaborate lies about her circumstances and connections. David's final attempt to reach me came at sunset, when the reality of their situation had become undeniable. "Mom, please, I don't understand what's happening," he said in a voicemail that revealed genuine distress beneath his confusion. "We're supposed to be staying here for our honeymoon, and now we're locked out with nowhere to go. Miranda's parents are here, and this is really embarrassing for everyone. Can you please call me back and help us figure this out?" But by then, Miranda had moved past embarrassment into full rage mode. "This is elder abuse," she shouted into her phone during what was apparently another voicemail to me. "You're deliberately sabotaging your son's honeymoon because you're jealous of our happiness. This is probably illegal, and we're going to take legal action if you don't resolve this situation immediately." The irony of Miranda accusing me of elder abuse while being filmed by security cameras at a property she was attempting to use without permission was so perfect that I actually laughed out loud. Her own words were creating evidence that would be invaluable if she tried to pursue any legal action against me. As darkness fell over Lake Windermere and the temperature began to drop, the group was forced to acknowledge that their planned honeymoon at my property was not going to happen. The last footage I watched showed them loading their bags back into their cars, Miranda's friends looking confused and disappointed, David appearing genuinely bewildered, and Miranda herself alternating between fury and what looked like growing panic as she realized that her carefully constructed plans were collapsing in the most public way possible. The honeymoon disaster was complete, but the real reckoning was just beginning. Somewhere in town, David was probably receiving and reading the letter I'd sent, learning the truth about his wife's deception and manipulation for the first time. The choice he made in response to that information would determine not just his future with Miranda, but whether the relationship between mother and son that she'd been systematically destroying could ever be rebuilt. The fallout from the honeymoon disaster began almost immediately and spread through our small lakeside community like ripples across still water. By Saturday morning, the story of the newlyweds locked out of the family estate was being discussed in coffee shops, shared on local social media groups, and dissected by neighbors who'd witnessed the evening's drama. But the real explosion came when David finally read my letter and began to understand the full scope of what Miranda had been doing to our family. Helen called me at 7 a.m., her voice tight with controlled fury. "Dorothy, I just got off the phone with David. He's been calling family members all night, asking if we knew about Miranda's debt and her research into elder abuse laws. He's devastated, honey. He had no idea what she'd been planning." The pain in my sister's voice reflected the anguish I knew David must be experiencing as he realized how completely he'd been manipulated by the woman he'd married. But while David was grappling with the truth about his wife, Miranda was doubling down on her victim narrative. Her social media posts from Saturday morning painted a picture of persecution by a bitter, elderly woman who couldn't accept her son's happiness when family members used property as weapons against love. Read one Instagram caption, accompanied by a photo of herself looking sad and betrayed outside a hotel. "Some people can't handle change or sharing." The comments on Miranda's posts told a different story than the one she was trying to create. Several of David's longtime friends had apparently been contacted by him during his late-night truth-seeking calls, and they were now commenting with questions that exposed the gaps in Miranda's narrative. "Wait, David said his mom was excluded from your wedding. Why wasn't his mother invited?" wrote one. "David David says his mom owns that house outright and never gave permission for you to use it. What's really going on here?" wrote another. My nephew, Michael, bless him, had taken it upon himself to document the unraveling of Miranda's deception in real time. "Aunt Dorothy, you need to see this," he told me during his visit Saturday afternoon. "Miranda's blog about marrying for money has gone viral, but not in the way she intended. People are sharing it as an example of predatory behavior toward elderly family members." He showed me screenshots of social media posts where Miranda's own writings were being used to expose her true motivations. The professional consequences for David began almost immediately. His engineering firm had a strict ethics policy, and the revelation that he'd been involved, however unwittingly, in a scheme to defraud an elderly family member created serious concerns about his judgment and integrity. He's been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, Helen explained during one of our conversations. Even though everyone believes he was manipulated, the company has to protect itself from any association with elder abuse. But perhaps the most devastating blow to Miranda's carefully constructed world came from her own family. Her parents, who had been brought to witness her access to family wealth and had instead witnessed her public humiliation, were apparently asking pointed questions about her financial situation and her treatment of David's mother. "Miranda's mother called me," Helen reported. "She wanted to apologize for her daughter's behavior and to understand what had really been happening." The community response was swift and decisive. Local business owners who had been courted by Miranda, her sponsorship deals and social media partnerships, began distancing themselves from her brand. The yoga studio where she'd claimed to work issued a statement clarifying that she'd never been an employee, only an occasional substitute instructor. Even the hotel where they'd been forced to spend their honeymoon asked them to check out. Early, after other guests complained about Miranda's loud phone arguments in the lobby, David's friends and co-workers were having their own reckoning with the role they'd played in enabling Miranda's manipulation. Several people who had attended the wedding called to apologize for not questioning why the groom's mother hadn't been invited. "We assumed there was some family drama we didn't understand," one of David's college friends explained to Helen. "We should have asked more questions, should have reached out to you directly." But the most satisfying response came from the legal community. Word of Miranda's attempted elder abuse scheme had reached the state attorney general's office, which opened a preliminary investigation into her activities. Mrs. Patterson, the investigator who contacted me, explained, "What you've documented represents a textbook case of attempted financial exploitation of an elderly family member. Even though she didn't succeed in accessing your assets, the planning and research she conducted constitute criminal conspiracy." Miranda's reaction to the legal scrutiny was predictably dramatic. She hired an attorney and began making statements about being the victim of a vindictive mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's marriage. But her lawyer quickly distanced himself from the case once he reviewed the evidence of her systematic deception and criminal planning. No reputable attorney wants to be associated with defending attempted elder abuse. Robert Martinez explained to me with satisfaction. The social media aspect of Miranda's downfall was perhaps the most publicly humiliating element of her reckoning. Her followers, who had been promised access to luxury lifestyle content, began demanding explanations for the gap between her promises and her reality. "You said you were honeymooning at a family estate, but you were actually locked out of someone else's house." One comment read, "How much of everything you've posted has been lies?" David's own social media presence, which Miranda had carefully curated to present him as a successful provider with family wealth, became a liability as friends and colleagues began questioning the authenticity of their lifestyle. Photos of expensive dinners and luxury vacations were now being viewed as evidence of financial irresponsibility rather than success, especially once people learned about the massive debt Miranda had been hiding. The most heartbreaking aspect of the community reckoning was watching David confront the extent to which his relationships had been damaged by Miranda's manipulation. Friends who had been gradually excluded from his life came forward to explain how Miranda had convinced David they were jealous of his success or bad influences on his growth. She isolated him from everyone who might have warned him about her behavior, one of his oldest friends told Helen. But there were also signs of hope in the community response. People who genuinely cared about David rallied around him as he began to understand the scope of Miranda's deception. His boss, despite the administrative leave, made it clear that David's job would be waiting for him once the investigation concluded, and he demonstrated that he understood the seriousness of what had happened. The local community, which had been initially entertained by the honeymoon drama, began to understand that they'd witnessed something much more serious than family family disagreement. Elder abuse was a real problem that affected many families, and Miranda's systematic campaign against me represented exactly the kind of predatory behavior that destroyed elderly people's financial security and family relationships. As the weekend progressed and more details of Miranda's deception became public knowledge, the community's sympathy shifted decisively toward me, and Miranda had transformed from a sympathetic newlywed locked out of her honeymoon destination into a recognized predator who had targeted an elderly woman's assets while manipulating her son's love and loyalty. The reckoning was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted completely. Miranda's carefully constructed identity as the wronged wife was crumbling under the weight of evidence about her true motivations and methods. David was beginning to understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated and used, and the community was learning valuable lessons about the sophisticated ways that elder abuse could be disguised as family concern and financial planning. The woman who had excluded me from my son's wedding while planning to steal my assets was discovering that public humiliation was only the beginning of the consequences she would face for treating family relationships as business opportunities and elderly relatives as resources to be harvested for personal gain. David's call came at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning, his voice hoarse from what had clearly been a sleepless night processing the revelations in my letter. "Mom," he said, his words barely above a whisper, "I need to see you. I need to understand what happened to us, what she did to us. Can I come over?" The pain in his voice was heartbreaking, but also gave me hope that the son I'd raised was still there, buried under 2 years of systematic manipulation and lies. I met him at the front door of the lake house, and the man who stood on my porch was barely recognizable as the confident groom I'd seen in those wedding photos just a week earlier. David looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days, his eyes red-dreamed from crying, his usually neat appearance disheveled and worn. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said before I could even speak. "I'm so sorry for everything she made me believe about you, about us. I don't know how I let this happen." We sat on the deck overlooking the lake. It's the same deck where I'd been tending roses when Jessica had made her first audacious demand months earlier. "David, you were manipulated by an expert," I said, taking his hand the way I had when he was a child and needed comfort. "Miranda spent 2 years systematically isolating you from me while building false narratives about both of our behaviors. You're not responsible for being deceived by someone you trusted, right?" But David was struggling with guilt that went beyond just being manipulated. "Mom, I looked at our phone records last night. For 8 months, Miranda was answering your calls and texts, pretending to be me. You were trying to reach me, trying to maintain our relationship, and I never knew because she was intercepting everything." The revelation was clearly devastating for him. It's the realization that his mother had been trying to connect while he'd been told. She was becoming distant and demanding. The evidence I'd gathered through Patricia's investigation had shattered every assumption David had about his marriage and his wife's character. "She has $250,000 in debt that I knew nothing about," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The wedding cost 3 times what she told me, and it's all on credit cards I co-signed without understanding what I was agreeing to. Our entire lifestyle has been built on lies and borrowed money." But perhaps the most painful discovery for David was learning about Miranda's long-term plans for gaining control of my assets. "She was researching how to have you declared incompetent. Mom, she was planning to destroy your independence and steal everything you've worked for. And she was using me as an unwitting accomplice in her scheme." The shame in his voice was palpable. It's the recognition that he'd been a tool in his wife's campaign against his own mother. Miranda's reaction to David's confrontation with the truth had been revealing in its complete lack of genuine remorse. "She's not apologizing for what she did," David explained. "She's angry that she got caught. She keeps insisting that wealthy people have obligations to help their families, that your secrecy about the money was a form of abuse, that she was justified in everything she did because we deserved access to your resources." The entitlement was stunning, even by Miranda's standards. Rather than acknowledging her systematic deception and manipulation, she was doubling down on her belief that my financial resources should be available to solve her problems. She actually said that if you'd just been honest about your wealth from the beginning, none of this would have been necessary. David continued, "As if your privacy about your finances somehow justified her criminal behavior." But Miranda wasn't just refusing to accept responsibility for her actions. She was threatening to destroy David financially and emotionally if he chose his mother over her schemes. "She's demanding demanding that I choose between her and you, Mom. She says if I don't support her in fighting your false accusations, she'll divorce me and leave me responsible for all the debt she accumulated. She's treating our marriage like a business partnership that I'm breach of contract. The conversation David described sounded like the final revelation of Miranda's true character. She told me that all marriages are essentially financial arrangements, that love is just the marketing people use to make those arrangements more palatable. She said she married me because I had potential earning power and family wealth, and that I should be grateful she chose me instead of someone with more obvious assets. The casual destruction of their marriage vows was breathtaking in its coldness. Miranda wasn't just admitting that she'd married David for mercenary reasons. She was suggesting that this was normal and reasonable behavior that he should appreciate rather than condemn. Mom, I keep thinking about all the time she redirected conversations away from you. All the excuses she made for why we couldn't visit or call more often. She was systematically destroying our relationship while I thought she was protecting me from family drama. But David's pain went beyond just recognizing Miranda's manipulation. He was also grappling with the financial consequences of 2 years of living beyond their means. I owe over $100,000 on credit cards I thought were being used for normal expenses, he explained. The wedding debt, the lifestyle costs, even basic living expenses were being inflated because Miranda was spending money on luxury items while telling me they were necessities. The professional consequences were also mounting. David's employer had completed their investigation and concluded that while he'd been manipulated rather than willfully complicit in elder abuse planning, his judgment and financial management raised serious concerns about his security clearance and professional reliability. I'm not losing my job, but I'm being transferred to a different department with lower pay and no advancement potential for at least 2 years, he said. Miranda's response to David's mounting problems had been to pressure him to ask me for financial help to solve their crisis. She actually suggested that I should ask you for money to pay off the debts she accumulated while planning to steal from you, David said with bitter irony. She still thinks your money should be available to solve problems she created, even after everything that's been exposed. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Miranda's character was her reaction to the community, backlash against her behavior. Rather than trying to make amends or rebuild her reputation through genuine change, she was focusing on damage control and victim playing. She's been calling everyone she knows, trying to convince them that you're a manipulative older woman who's jealous of our marriage and using your money as a weapon against our happiness. The legal consequences were becoming serious as well. The state attorney general's office had forwarded their preliminary investigation to local prosecutors, who were considering charges of attempted elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Miranda's lawyer told her she could face up to 5 years in prison if they decide to prosecute, David explained. Her response was to blame you for overreacting to what she calls normal family financial planning. As we talked through the morning and into the afternoon, David gradually began to accept that his marriage was over, regardless of what choice he made about our relationship. I can't stay married to someone who sees me as a resource to be exploited and you as an obstacle to be overcome, he said finally. Even if I wanted to try to rebuild trust with her, I don't think she's capable of understanding why her behavior was wrong. The decision David ultimately made was both painful and liberating. Mom, I want to rebuild our relationship, but I understand if you need time to trust me again after everything that's happened. I was manipulated, but I still failed to protect you from her schemes. I should have questioned her excuses, should have maintained our relationship despite her interference. His recognition of his own responsibilities, even as a victim of manipulation, showed me that the man I'd raised was still there, still capable of growth and accountability. David, relationships can be rebuilt when both people are committed to honesty and respect, I said. What matters now is not what Miranda convinced you to believe, but what you choose to do with the truth. The choice he made in that moment would determine not just his future with me, but his ability to rebuild his life on foundations of honesty rather than the lies and manipulation that had characterized his marriage. Miranda had given him an ultimatum: support her schemes or lose everything. But she'd miscalculated the power of truth and the strength of genuine family bonds that couldn't be permanently destroyed by even the most sophisticated manipulation. 6 months after the honeymoon disaster that exposed Miranda's systematic campaign against our family, I was sitting on my deck watching David teach his rebuilt life one deliberate step at a time. The divorce had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, with Miranda receiving nothing beyond her personal belongings and responsibility for the massive debt she'd accumulated during their marriage. The lake house that she'd tried to claim as a family estate remained exactly where it belonged in my name, under my control. The symbol of the boundaries that had saved both my financial security and my relationship with my son. David had moved into a modest apartment in town, downsizing from the lifestyle Miranda had created using borrowed money and false promises. His new living situation was a stark contrast to the luxury he'd become accustomed to during his marriage, but there was something peaceful in his demeanor that had been missing for years. I forgot how good it feels to live within my means," he said during one of our weekly dinners together. "Every bill I pay now is with money I actually earned. Every purchase is something I can actually afford." The financial rehabilitation had been painful but necessary. David was working 2 jobs to pay off the debt Miranda had accumulated in their names, refusing my offers to help because he needed to prove to himself that he could clean up the mess without relying on family wealth. "I need to rebuild my financial integrity from the ground up," he'd explained. "If I let you bail me out, I'll never really understand how I got into this situation or how to avoid it in the future." Miranda's own consequences had been severe and comprehensive. The criminal charges for attempted elder abuse had resulted in a plea bargain, 2 years of probation, community service specifically focused on elder care education, and restitution payments for the legal costs her schemes had generated. More devastating to her personally was the complete collapse of her social media presence and any prospects for the influencer lifestyle she'd been building around false access to family wealth. Her blog about marrying for money became evidence. In the prosecution case, Robert Martinez had explained with satisfaction. Her own writings documented premeditation and criminal intent better than any prosecutor could have hoped for. The woman who'd tried to monetize her manipulation of elderly family members had become a cautionary tale about the legal and social consequences of elder abuse. But perhaps the most important resolution was the rebuilding of trust between David and me. It hadn't happened overnight. There were months of careful conversations, gradual boundary setting, and mutual acknowledgement of the damage that Miranda's manipulation had caused to our relationship. "I keep discovering new ways she lied to both of us," David had said during one particularly difficult conversation. "Every memory I have of the past 2 years is contaminated by her deception." The process of rebuilding our relationship had required David to confront not just Miranda's manipulation, but his own responsibility for allowing it to happen. "I wanted to believe that I was protecting you from stress and conflict by limiting our contact," he'd admitted, "but really I was taking the easy path, avoiding difficult conversations about boundaries and expectations in my marriage." His recognition of his own role in the situation, even as a victim of systematic manipulation, had been crucial to our healing process. "David, healthy relationships require both people to be actively engaged in maintaining them," I'd explained. "When someone else is allowed to control or filter that relationship, it stops being genuine connection and becomes something else entirely." The lake house had become a symbol of the new boundaries we'd established. David was welcome to visit, to bring friends, to use the property for reasonable recreation, but always with advance notice, always with respect for my autonomy, and never with the assumption that family relationships automatically granted unlimited access to my resources. "This is your home, Mom," he'd said during his first post-divorce visit. "I'm grateful you're willing to share it with me, but I never want to take that generosity for granted again." The foundation I'd established to help other families resist elder financial exploitation had become my primary focus during the recovery period. The Dorothy Foundation for Family Financial Integrity provided education, legal assistance, and support for elderly people facing manipulation by family members, caregivers, or romantic partners. The first case we'd handled had been remarkably similar to my own experience. Widow, whose adult children were pressuring her to sell her home to fund their failing business ventures. "What you went through is unfortunately common," the Foundation's Director Sarah Walsh had explained during our monthly board meeting. "Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' assets often use emotional manipulation, isolation tactics, and false narratives about mental decline to gain control over elderly relatives' finances. Your case has become a template for recognizing and combating these schemes." The most satisfying aspect of the Foundation's work was the education component we developed for families about recognizing manipulation and maintaining healthy boundaries across generations. "Love doesn't require unlimited financial access" had become our motto, and it resonated with audiences across the country who'd experienced similar pressures from family members who viewed elderly relatives as resources rather than people. David had become an unexpected advocate for the Foundation's mission, speaking at conferences about his experience as an unwitting accomplice in elder abuse schemes. I thought I was being a good husband by supporting my wife's concerns about my mother, he'd said during one particularly powerful presentation. I didn't realize I was being used as a weapon against the woman who'd raised me and loved me unconditionally. His willingness to speak publicly about his experience, despite the personal embarrassment and professional consequences, had helped other families recognize similar manipulation patterns in their own relationships. When someone systematically isolates you from people you love while convincing you it's for everyone's good, that's not protection, that's control, had become one of his signature observations. Miranda had made several attempts to contact both David and me after the divorce was finalized, apparently believing that enough time had passed for her manipulation tactics to work again. She'd sent cards claiming to miss our family relationship, letters asking for help with her financial difficulties, and even shown up at David's workplace claiming to need closure conversations. Each attempt had been documented and forwarded to her probation officer, Kay, ensuring that her harassment would have legal consequences. The most telling aspect of Miranda's post-divorce behavior was her complete inability to accept responsibility for the destruction she'd caused. Even in court-mandated counseling sessions, she continued to insist that her behavior had been justified by our family's dysfunction and my unfair hoarding of wealth that should have been shared with younger family members. 1 year after the honeymoon that never happened, I received an unexpected letter from Miranda's mother, apologizing for her daughter's behavior and expressing gratitude that I hadn't pressed for maximum criminal penalties. "We raised Miranda to value hard work and integrity," she'd written. "We're devastated by what she became and the pain she caused your family. Thank you for giving our son-in-law the chance to rebuild his life with honesty." The letter had been touching in its sincerity, and it helped me understand that Miranda's manipulative behavior wasn't necessarily learned from her family but had developed from her own choices and values. Some people are raised with good values and choose to abandon them when it's convenient, Robert Martinez had observed. Miranda wasn't a victim of her upbringing. She was a predator who happened to come from a decent family. As I sat on my deck that evening, watching David help me plant new roses in the garden where this nightmare had begun, I reflected on how much had changed and how much had been preserved. The lake house that Miranda had tried to claim remained my sanctuary, more beautiful and peaceful than ever. The relationship with my son that she'd tried to destroy had been rebuilt on stronger foundations of honesty and mutual respect. Most importantly, I'd learned that financial independence wasn't just about having money. It was about having the power to set boundaries, demand respect, and refuse to accept treatment that diminished my dignity or autonomy. Miranda had tried to exploit my love for David as a weakness to be manipulated. Instead, she'd taught me that real love requires both people to maintain their integrity and self-respect. At 72, I was more confident and purposeful than I'd been in years. The foundation work gave me a sense of mission beyond my own family. The restored relationship with David gave me joy without the fear of manipulation or exploitation, and the financial security I'd always had but had never fully appreciated gave me the power to help other families facing similar challenges. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been excluded from important family events, or had someone tried to exploit your family relationships for financial gain? Comment below and tell me what city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. And remember, family relationships should be based on mutual love and respect, not on what resources one person can extract from another. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable behavior that's destructive to everyone involved. Thank you for following my journey to the very end.